Center bolt out of the axle. There's two ways to do this. I'll use an impact, it'll spin it right out. If you don't have an impact, what you can do is bolt the rotor back to the hub by putting in a couple of the wheel bolts and have an assistant step on the brakes. Doing that will lock everything up and you can use a breaker bar. This will either be a 14 millimeter or a 17 millimeter hex. Now I'm going to take the bolt, I'm going to put it in just a few threads, 4 or 5 turns, and I'm going to hit it. That'll push the CV through the hub. Make sure the CV is not stuck on the hub. Sometimes you'll have to tap it a few times with a hammer. If you do, use a plastic mallet. Make sure your steering wheel is unlocked. We're going to turn the steering wheel so the caliper comes out. Usually we're doing axles because of a broken CV boot. So the grease flings all over the place. Make sure you wear gloves and have plenty of rags on hand so you don't get grease all over the rotors as you go. Now we're going to remove the brake caliper and the caliper carrier. I'm going to take this all off as one piece. First thing I'm going to do, take a screwdriver, put it in the slots of the rotor and gently pry over. What that's going to do is compress the brake caliper a little bit right here. That gives me some room so that it'll come off. I'm going to take 2 bolts that have an 18 millimeter head, come in from the back side. There's one here, another one here. I'll show you that on the carrier a little later so you get an idea where they are. Remove those 2 bolts and the entire assembly is going to come off. You want to hold on to the caliper. Don't let it hang off of the lines or any of the wires. I use an old piece of brake hose. It's easy to bend, and I fashion a hook out of it and hook the caliper off of the suspension so it's up and out of the way. Now that that's out of the way, we can move on. The brake rotor comes right off. Here's our torn CV boot right there. The axle is going to come out of this space right here. Now we're going to remove the flange bolts on the inside of the axle. These are the triple square bolts you see all the way around this flange. These bolts tend to fill with debris, so you want to be very careful when you're putting the socket in that you get the socket wiggled all the way in. You may have to come along with a pick tool and clean them out. These triple squares are fairly easy to strip. So make sure that the socket's seated all the way before you start to remove the bolt. We'll take one bolt out and then spin the axle so we can get to the next one. The axle is going to come loose from the cup on the transmission. Then the whole axle goes up toward the transmission. Now we can slide the axle out in one piece from behind the spindle, and the old axle is out of the car. You can replace just the outer CV boot, but it's usually cheaper from a labor point of view and easier to replace the entire axle. I suggest my customers buy their axles from Raxles. Their online store is great, their customer service is great. You get the axle, there's a prepaid return label, a little pocket knife, so that you can send your cord back to them. The axle comes fully rebuilt. He uses synthetic grease, and he even includes the tools. Usually when you do the German axles, the tools that you're going to need are in there. The 17 millimeter, in this case hex, the triple square for the inside axle, and a new bolt for the end of the axle. It's a stretched bolt, so we need to replace that. Again, great guys to do business with. Whenever I sell axles here in the shop, I sell Raxles axles. Slide it in just as I slid the other one out through the hole in the frame. Put it up over the cup a little bit. And take and get it started on the outer end in the hub. That'll give me enough room to get it to squeeze down in place. Let it sit on the cup, and I would start all of the bolts before you tighten any bolts. You can just start them by hand. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten all the bolts down. There's no particular order. Tighten them to a torque spec, get it out of your Bentley manual or service manual. I'll zing them in quick with the impact and then go back with a torque wrench and set the torque. Just spin the axle to the next one. Keep going until you go all the way around. Now I've gone and torqued the inside axle bolts down to specification. Depending on exactly what chassis, what model, what engine and transmission you have, there's different bolts used there. So the torque spec varies. I would be very careful to torque those down. They do have a habit of working loose if they're not tightened enough. If they work loose, all of the power will be transferred to the one axle that does not have any resistance and the car will stop moving. Now I'm going to take the bolt that goes into the end of the axle and I'm going to thread it in. This is just going to keep the axle from coming out as I work. The torque spec on this is very tight. In this case, on this car, it's over 140 foot-pounds. So we're going to have to tighten it once we can get the hub locked in place. We can't do that until we get the brake rotor back on and bolted down. But we'll put it in just snug right now so that it can't fall out. The axle won't come apart as we put the brake rotor and the caliper back on. As I mentioned earlier, we took the caliper carrier off, left the carrier on the caliper so it's all in one piece. These are where the carrier bolts go in. Just wanted to show you when everything's apart so that you could see where they were on the back side of the axle. Now we're going back together. I'm going to take the rotor, put the rotor back on. I'll put one of the lug bolts in the rotor just to hold it. We'll take the caliper off of the hook that we had it placed on, slide it over the rotor, and then reach in from the inside, start both of our carrier bolts, and then tighten them up. Make sure you take your hook out. Now we'll tighten up the carrier bolts. Now we got to torque down the pinch bolt on the end. As I said before, this gets about 140 foot-pounds on this model. It's very high on all of them. So what we're going to do is have someone stand on the brake and we'll tighten this down to specifications. We've tightened down the bolt to the specification. We'll take a rag, wipe as much grease off of the rotor as we can. We're going to put the wheel on. Your tool kit has this in it. In case you didn't know what that was, if you thread it in right here, gives you something to hang the wheel off as you put the rest of the lugs in. We'll put all the bolts back in the wheel, tighten it down, clean all the greasy fingerprints off of it, and we're all done. Now we've got the wheel tightened down. One last thing before you either give the car back to your customer or drive it yourself. Since we compressed the brake caliper the first few times you move the brake pedal, the brakes aren't going to work as that piston squeezes out. So before you start the car up, you want to step on the brakes 3 or 4 times until you have a good firm brake pedal. Then you can start it up, put it in gear, go for a road test.